7 Habits of Highly Successful Slaves. This is part 2 of more than 2. That's all I know for sure. We're not getting very far today. We're going to stick with the first one. Last time we saw a few important things to notice in the Joseph story. We're going through the life of Joseph. We're going through the life and the character of Joseph, a study in the story of Joseph, not Mary's husband in the New Testament, Joseph, the son of Jacob, the grandson of Isaac, and the great-grandson of Abraham. So we're going through the story of Joseph, and I basically just introduced to you the 7 habits of highly successful slaves. But the main thing I wanted to do and tried to do what last Sunday was to emphasize that Joseph was not on the slippery slope into slavery. Joseph was already bought and paid for in a bad way. He was already a slave. He was already sold. He was already in the slave market, on the slave market. He wasn't losing his rights as we seem to be doing in America these days, and we might be complaining about. He had already lost his rights. And this is important. This is important for us because we see what we see as losing our rights, Joseph saw as already done. It was already a done deal. He was a slave, a literal slave. He had no rights. He had lost all of them. And so we can learn from Joseph. We can learn from Joseph, especially us who seem to be losing rights, who seem to be losing some of our freedoms. Well, Joseph lost all of it. And we can see from his story, we can see that he was, it says in the text, successful as a slave. And so we learn in this story 7 habits of highly successful slaves. He wasn't losing them. He already lost them. He had no freedom. He had no liberty. He had no rights. And if anyone felt entitled to complain, it was Joseph. I mean, he had plenty to complain about. We complain because it's been a whole 3 months since we got a pay raise. I can't believe it. It's been 3 months. Joseph didn't get he didn't get paid to work. He got sold to work, right? That's him. Not paid, he got sold to work. It didn't matter if he liked his boss. It didn't matter if he loved his job. He was a slave. He was a slave. It wasn't his career of choice, I guarantee. It wasn't something he chose. He was someone God had chosen. And there was a story bigger than him. God was doing something in the life of Joseph. He was chosen by God for something bigger than him, bigger than his dreams. I mentioned last week, but our problem, besides our tiny faith, is that we think slavery is the final stage in a dying culture and the end of civilization as we know it. We see slavery as, oh, that's it. We're done. Especially if we're enslaved by tyrants, by despots. We're done. So we fight our freedom in a way that assumes slavery means the fight is over. Slavery means we lost. And this is in our own thinking. But with God, it's different. God is the God of resurrection. He's the God of resurrection. Just as death doesn't stop him or his plans, neither does slavery. In the story of Joseph, slavery is not the end of the story. In fact, it's right towards the beginning of the story. God uses death, God uses slavery to accomplish his covenant purposes and his ultimate plan. And so it's easy for us to get discouraged when we see things bad happening. But as I've said, as we've gone through this story so far, this whole story is about God working all things, good and bad, together for the good of those who love him, who are called by him, according to his purpose, according to his plan. God uses all of it. So in our text, when Joseph is sold to Potiphar as a slave, we would be wrong to assume that the sad story is over. And we should never pay attention anymore. Just quit. The movie's done. The sovereign God and creator and sustainer of the universe never loses sleep over slavery, never loses sleep over death. In fact, death was the central focus of all history, the death of his son. When everybody thought all hope was lost, that's when all hope was gained at the cross. And so we see this with Joseph as well. Death and slavery are actually two of God's favorite costumes or masks that he likes to use as a way to disguise triumphs as tragedies. He uses death and slavery to cover up and to pretend that triumphs are tragedies. As Christians on this side of the cross, we know better. We should know that the seeming ultimate tragedy of all time, was actually the ultimate triumph of all time. Never forget that Joseph is constantly pointing us to Jesus. He's constantly pointing us to Jesus. And as Paul put it so well in his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 2, 6 through 9, it says, "Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away, but we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him." Everyone involved in crucifying Christ at Calvary forgot the lesson they should have learned from the life and story of Joseph. What they mean for evil, God actually means for good. None of the rulers, Paul says, none of the rulers of this age understood this. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Joseph's brothers had not understood this. For if they had, they would not have sold their brother, the Lord of dreams. Just as when Jesus was betrayed by Judas, his friend, so Joseph, when he was betrayed by Judah, his brother, he could have assumed that all hope was lost. But God is sovereign. He's sovereign. And he's writing this story. Slavery is not the end of this story. God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. God's all-powerful. He can turn slavery into liberty. He can turn tragedy into triumph. And that's exactly what he does. Joseph, in our text, was betrayed by his brothers, sold to Potiphar. He goes from the pit to Potiphar to prison. He could have given up. He could have given up all hope. Little did he know that he was just a shadow, an arrow pointing forward to Jesus. He was a victim pointing forward to victory. And this is why our text could say that a slave could be described in our text as successful. It says Joseph was successful. He was a successful man. The first thing that we noticed last week is that Joseph is described as successful 3 times in our text. Verse 2, this is in Genesis 39. Verse 2, and he became a successful man. Verse 3, Yahweh caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. And verse 23, and whatever he did, Yahweh made to succeed. Some people don't like success. Here's something else I also mentioned last week. It's worth repeating. One of the things we see in the story of Joseph is a different definition of success, a different definition of success than we're used to in our modern way of thinking. Success is not about results. It's about responsibility. It's not about outcome. It's about obedience. It's not about benefits. It's about behavior. The success that we're reading about in our text, in the Bible, in Genesis. It's not about pragmatism. It's about principle. Biblical success is covenantal. It's all about covenantal faithfulness. As I said last week, we're never told, be successful, thou shalt succeed. But that's not the kind of success that the Bible describes, especially in the story of Joseph. He was a slave, and he was successful. As a slave, he was successful. Because it's not about outcome, it's about obedience. It's about faithfulness. We and as Americans think we have it bad because we're losing our rights. Joseph, again, lost all of them. He was a slave, and he also was successful. We could learn a lot from Joseph in our text. 7 habits of highly successful slaves. The Bible tells us how to fight for our rights, but it also shows us how to live when we've lost them, how to live when we've lost rights. The answer is never quit, never give up. The answer is how should we now live when your rights are stolen, when your freedom is taken. Slavery is not the time to wave the white flag and give up. Slavery is the time to shine and see God do what he does best. And so with all that being said, let's all stand for the reading of our text. The reading of God's holy, inspired, infallible, inerrant word. And we're going to read the beginning of chapter 39 and the end. Genesis 39, 1 through 6, and verses 20 through 23. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. Yahweh was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that Yahweh was with him, and that Yahweh caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of Yahweh was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. And Joseph's master, this is going to the end of the chapter. The beginning of the chapter, he's a slave under Potiphar. At the end of the chapter, he's a prisoner. And it says, and Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. But Yahweh was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because Yahweh was with him. And whatever he did, Yahweh made it succeed. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. So, maybe you feel like you're not as free as you used to be. Maybe you feel like things are a little sketchy in our culture today. We seem to be losing some of those rights that we enjoy. How should we then live? Our text gives us a clear answer in showing us 7 habits of highly successful slaves. Most of us can't claim to be slaves in the same sense that Joseph was a slave, but even if we're on the slippery slope of slavery, how should we then live? There's 7 practical things that we can start doing right now. You have a choice. Complain about your soft version of slavery, or start implementing these 7 habits of highly successful slaves. So let's again go over them, and then we're going to look at the first one today. We'll try to get through more than one at a time. But today, we're going to look at the first one. They're on the back of your bulletin if you want to look at them. 7 habits of highly successful slaves. Again, I came up with the title before I studied the text, so I was happy to find there was 7. And not only that, there was 7 at the beginning of the chapter when he was a slave, and there's 7 at the end of the chapter when he was a prisoner, and they correlate, they're the same thing. So the first one, living coram Deo, which means in the presence of God, before the face of God. That's in verse 2. Yahweh was with Joseph. 2, letting your light shine. Verse 3, his master saw that Yahweh was with him. Number 3, loosening your grip. Again, verse 3, Yahweh caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Number 4, led by grace. That's verse 4. So Joseph found favor in his sight. 5, lead by serving. So Joseph attended him. He served him. 6, loyal stewardship. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. And number 7, laboring faithfully. Because of him, he had no concern about anything. And then underneath that, we have the chart comparing the first section of the chapter to the last part of the chapter. It's like bookends, and we see these 7 habits on the beginning and the end of chapter 39. And that's all there to see. So let's begin with number 1. The first habit of a highly successful slave. Living coram Deo. What does that mean? Living coram Deo. Verse 2 in our text, Genesis 39:2. Yahweh was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. That verse alone, it's like a, what are you talking about? Bible? What do you mean? Yahweh was with him, okay. And he became a successful man, makes sense. And then it says, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. He was a slave. What? Yes, he was a slave. As a prisoner, all the way down in verse 21, this is after Potiphar's wife does her thing and tries to get Joseph seduced, and he resists, and then she gets him thrown into prison. Then it says down in verse 21, but Yahweh was with Joseph. He's still with Joseph. But yeah, he's in prison now. But Yahweh was with him. Joseph, you could say, was very, very much alone. He lost everything he had. He lost his home. He lost his family. He lost your attention. Just kidding. He lost everything. His possessions. He lost his coat, of all things. His fancy coat. His long coat. He was all alone. It sure felt like God had even abandoned him. But the text says Yahweh was with Joseph. He felt alone. But as you know, feelings don't have much of an IQ. Feelings don't have a brain. Feelings don't come from the brain. The fact was that God was there. It didn't feel like it. He was a slave and then he was a prisoner. But God was right there with him. Coram Deo. He was in the presence of God. He was living coram Deo. R.C. Sproul defines what it means to live coram Deo like this. Very simply, he says, to live coram Deo is to live one's entire life in the presence of God, under the authority of God, to the glory of God. In a situation like Joseph was in, it's easy to become overwhelmed. It's easy to become overwhelmed by fear. But you have, as I said last week, you have to fight fear with fear, the fear of the Lord. The only solution to the fear of man is to fear God. My old friend, when I was a teenager, we both made up our own quote. We loved quotes, so we would always read quotes and quote quotes. That's what you do with quotes. You quote them. But then we want to make up our own quotes. And I remember his, now I'm not going to remember what it was, but it was, fear God and your enemies will be fearing you. That was his favorite quote. And mine was, only you can be you and your duty do. Wow, I'll give you a minute to think about that one. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of what? Wisdom. No, knowledge. No, it's both. The Bible says both. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Ed Welch, I gave this quote last week, but he gives a definition of the fear of the Lord. He says, the fear of the Lord is knowing that I live coram Deo. Ed Welch, he's written many great books on, he's a counselor, but he says the fear of the Lord is knowing that I live coram Deo, before the face of God. It's knowing that the holy God sees every aspect of my life. The result is that we live knowing that we are seen. We live knowing that we are seen. We live publicly and follow Christ in joyful and reverential obedience. That's Edward Welch. The presence of the Lord can be one of two things. It can be either comforting or it can be very concerning. Sometimes we like or we prefer our imaginary privacy, right? We like to just find a little bit of comfort in the fact that we have privacy. The omnipresence of God can actually freak us out. The omnipresence of God scares us. Remember the story of Jonah? That's what that was all about. He tried to forget the fact that God is everywhere. God is omnipresent. He's all over. He's everywhere. He's omnipresent. Jonah was attempting to run from God. Jonah was trying to get away from the presence of God. Joseph was trying to hide from the coram deo, the presence of God, the face of God. But we all know how well that turned out. You try to hide from the presence of God, you turn into fish puke. That's the bottom line to the Jonah story. A key characteristic of the fear of the Lord is that God sees. He sees. The one who sits on the throne. Yes, he's transcendent. Yes, he's above us, beyond us. He's beyond our comprehension, but he also sees. He's not just transcendent, he's immanent. He's here. He's among us. He's with us. He's God with us. He sees us. We're always under the watchful eye of our loving Heavenly Father. Anytime we begin to allow sin to slip into our lives, it's because we start to wrongly assume that we can keep some area of our life secret. I mean, really, think about it. If you sin at all, you're deluded. You've deluded yourself. You've deceived yourself into thinking you're in secret. You're doing this alone in the dark. We're so easily duped by our own little deceitful hearts. Yes, our own deceitful hearts. Do not follow your hearts. I don't care what Disney says. Don't do it. Stop. You're deceiving yourself. We're so easily deceived that we think God is looking the other way or God is taking a nap while we secretly getting away with this secret stuff. No. Our little deceitful heart is so good at what it does that it tricks us into thinking that we're actually getting away with it. There's no incognito with God. The tiny little lying heart of yours and mine that the world says to follow turns you into an idiot. Let's just be honest. Turns me into an idiot to think that the omnipresent God of the universe, the all-present God of the universe, is not seeing this. He's not seeing what I'm doing. Just think of all the things you do coram deo in the presence of God, before the face of God, which you would never do in front of anyone else. I mean, that's how deceitful our heart is. You would never think about doing some things that you do in the presence of God. You would never think about doing that in front of anyone else in the world. The all-seeing, omnipresent God who's holy, holy, holy. We typically indulge our sin or neglect our duty without much guilt when we believe that no one's watching, no one's watching and no one's going to find out. Just think about what happens when you get caught in the act. We're embarrassed, right? We're suddenly embarrassed. Why? You were already being watched by the one who matters. What we thought was hidden in the dark is suddenly exposed in the light. True reality, though, is that we're never totally private. We're never in total privacy. Psalm 90, verse 8 says, "You have set our iniquities before you." This is a prayer to God. "You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence." Oh, no. Our secret sins in the light of your presence. Then down in verse 11 and 12 of Psalm 90, "Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. See that? Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? And then he says, teach us to number our days, to have a heart of wisdom. The secret to having a heart of wisdom is to fear God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's to know that we are living coram Deo. We're in the presence of God. That's what the fear of God is, living coram Deo. But it can be scary. It can be comforting, or it can be a scary thing. In our flesh, we like to stay in the dark. Unlike Joseph, Jonah ran from God, tried to hide from God. Adam and Eve were the first ones that did it, right? They were the first ones that thought they could hide from God and cover their own sins with fig leaves, being a picture of fruitlessness, just fruitless trees covered in fig branches. Someone mentioned that at the conference we were just at. I liked it. I even wrote that as one of my notes. Listen, Genesis 3, verse 8. And they, speaking of Adam and Eve, and they heard the sound of Yahweh, God, walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God among the trees of the garden. There it is. They thought they hid themselves from Yahweh God, from the presence of, it says, from the presence of Yahweh God among the trees of the garden. But Yahweh God called to the man and said, where are you? Again, this is like a father speaking to his son with food all over his face. What'd you do? Did you get chocolate all over his face? Did you get into the cookie jar? I know he got into the cookie jar, right? So God said, where are you? He knows where they're at. They're not hiding from the omnipresent God. And he said, I heard the sound of, this is Adam, I heard the sound of you in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. He said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? The man said, the woman you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree and I ate. Women, come on. Then Yahweh God said to the woman, what is this that you have done? The woman said, the serpent deceived me and I ate. So notice our first solution to our own failure to live coram Deo before the presence of God, in the face of God. Our first, what we think is the solution is to blame, shift the blame, make excuses. Adam managed to blame two people at once. He said, the woman you gave me. He's blaming the woman and God. Of course, anytime we blame anything, we're blaming God, right? Because God is sovereign. God is the one who wrote the whole story. He wrote the script. So any kind of complaint you have is a complaint against the sovereignty of God. It's a complaint against God. Any kind of blame you shift is a blaming of God. The woman you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree and I ate. I asked Lisa this morning, I said, what did I ask you? I said, have you ever blamed me for anything? She said, I blame you for everything. Take that Proverbs 31 comment I made earlier back. Okay, if you ever want to be reminded about coram Deo, if you ever want to remind your stupid heart that's trying to trick you into thinking that you are being tricky with the all-seeing, omnipresent God of the universe, read Psalm 139. Go back to Psalm 139, read it again, remind yourself, remind your heart not to be silly. Psalm 139, starting in verse 1, listen. O Yahweh, you have searched me and know me. There he is. He's just acknowledging it right at the start. You've searched, you know. You know when I sit down, when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You know it altogether. You hem me in and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's high. I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Where are you going to go? Away from the spirit of the omnipresent God of the universe. That's what he says. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? Where shall I go away from coram Deo? Coram Deo. Verse 8, if I ascend to heaven, you're there. You're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, like Jonah, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. Do you see that? See what he's saying? He's saying, I think I'm being sneaky when I'm in the dark. I think I'm getting away with stuff. He says, no, even the darkness is light with you, Lord. The psalmist is acknowledging and remembering that every moment of every day is continually lived coram Deo, before the presence of God, before the face of God, in the fear of God, which should give us the fear of God, a healthy fear of God. Another great quote from the late Robert Charles Sproul, known as R.C. Sproul, says this: to be aware of the presence of God is also to be acutely aware of his sovereignty. The uniform experience of the saints is to recognize that God is God. Then he is indeed, if God is God, then he is indeed sovereign. Living under divine sovereignty involves more than a reluctant submission to sheer sovereignty that is motivated out of a fear of punishment. It involves recognizing that there is no higher goal than offering honor to God. Our lives are to be living sacrifices, oblations offered in a spirit of adoration and gratitude. We all have all kinds of fears. We have all kinds of phobias. These are kind of fun to read sometimes, so I pulled them out again. These my little fears, phobias. What are some of your phobias? Arachnophobia, fear of... Oh, yes. This is a test. Aerophobia? You can probably guess that one. Fear of flying. Yes. That's when you pray sincerely when you're on a plane and there's turbulence. Oh, Lord, I mean it this time. We just went on a plane, and it was September 11th when we were flying, the 20-year anniversary of September 11th. Who does that? Troy and me decided that was a good day to travel. Acrophobia, fear of heights. Astrophobia, fear of thunder and lightning and thunder. I don't know what the fear of phobia of that song is, but claustrophobia, yikes, I don't like that one. Zoophobia, fear of animals, yeah. And here's some weird ones. Electrophobia, fear of chickens. So you can't go to the men's meeting because they have chickens. Acmephobia, fear of needles or pointed objects. That seems like a pointless fear. Cacophobia, fear of ugliness. No, I don't need to worry about that one. Pogonophobia, fear of beards. Okay, you get the point. The one thing we don't have a fear of that we should have is the fear of God. The fear of God. And it's because we forget we're living in the presence of God. We're living before the face of God. We're living coram Deo. Martin Luther made an important distinction regarding the fear of God. He distinguished between servile fear and familial fear, or filial fear. He described servile fear as the kind of fear a prisoner has for his torturer. Filial fear is the fear a son has, who loves his father and does not want to offend him or let him down. It's a fear that comes from respect and reverence. When the Bible calls us to fear God, it's a call to fear out of reverence for God, out of awe and adoration. We've lost a lot of that in evangelicalism today. A fear of God, a reverence for God. We've replaced reverence with relevance. Instead of fearing God, we're fear, being cool shamed or whatever. Joseph had plenty of things to fear. I mean, he was sold to foreigners in a foreign land as a slave. Who knows what was going to happen to him? He didn't know. He had plenty of things to fear. If anyone had a reason for servile fear, it was Joseph, a slave, then a prisoner. And we just had to put ourselves into his sandals and imagine his fears. But in spite of all his troubles, all his trials, his tribulations and testings, the text says he was a successful man. He was successful. He became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master because Yahweh was with Joseph. Excuse me. The story of Joseph is a story about a successful slave. But the first secret to his success, the first habit of highly successful slaves is to live coram Deo, to recognize the fact that you are in the presence of the omnipresent God. In a time of being alone as someone can be, Yahweh was with him. It didn't feel like it, but Yahweh was with him. That's my grandson. He thought no one was with him. He could just go wherever he wanted. But Carissa was with him. Mama was with him. The covenantal name of God, Yahweh, is used over and over in our text. The name Yahweh, it's actually only used 3 other times in the whole story of Joseph. But in chapter 39, it's used 8 times. 8 times. Yahweh is with Joseph. This is the covenantal name of God. Yahweh is with him. The only reason it was possible for a slave to be successful was because Yahweh, the God of covenant, the God of promises, covenant promises, Yahweh was with him. Apart from Yahweh, slavery is the end of the story. It's interesting that we begin with the presence of Yahweh, and then we fast forward to the end of the story of Joseph in Genesis. It ends with the same emphasis. I'll just read it to you. Chapter 45 in Genesis. We're in chapter 39. If you skip forward to 45, it says, verse 5, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves." This is Joseph talking to his brothers when they realize it's him. He says, "Don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." God sent me. God was with me. He did this. "For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, the Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." Joseph knew from the beginning to the end why he went through all that he went through, especially at the end. He knew now why he went through all the junk he went through. God was behind all of it. God was with him. Yahweh was with him. Yahweh made him successful as a slave. Yahweh made him succeed as a prisoner. Yahweh was there all along. He was behind all of it. He was writing and directing the script. God was with him. It was God that sent him. And then in chapter 50, it says, "Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God, the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. He didn't choke them. He wasn't angry. He wept when they were speaking, when they were confessing, basically. His brothers also came and fell down before him. said, "Behold, we are your servants." There's the answer. There's the dream he had coming true. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for I am in the place of God. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. God was there all along. God had a plan all along. God was in all of it. When his life seemed like it had fallen off the rails, everything was right on track. God was in it all and behind it all, through it all. Yahweh was with Joseph. How did he succeed in a situation like that? Yahweh was with him. He was living coram Deo. He was living in the presence of God. God promised to be with Isaac. God promised to be with Jacob. Now we see the same thing is true with Joseph. Slavery is not evidence for deism. Slavery is not evidence for deism. What is deism? Deism is that theology, I guess you could say, where you believe God is like the great clockmaker in the sky. He wound up the earth and it started ticking and then he took off. He's not involved. He created everything and then left, and then everything's kind of just running on natural law. That's deism. But slavery is not an evidence for deism. Slavery is not proof that God isn't around. Slavery, bad things, you could say, not just slavery, anything bad, evil things that are happening to you, bad things that are happening, trials, tests, tribulations, troubles, all of it is not evidence that God is absent. It's not at all evidence that he's a deistic God out doing his own thing. He is there. He's behind it all. He's using it all together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. What they mean for evil, what Joseph's brothers meant for evil, God meant for good. This is something that Joshua was reminded of. We talked about Joseph and we talked about Jonah. Now let's talk about another J named Joshua. This is something he was reminded of in Joshua 1, verse 8 and 9. It says, this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous. Notice this is that's successful. There it is again. Meditate on the law of God. Meditate day and night. Meditation is a biblical concept. I don't know if we think about that very often. The Psalm 1, blessed is the man who walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. In his law, he meditates day and night. Not Eastern meditation where you empty your mind and just don't think of anything. It's meditate on his word. Meditate on his law. So he says, meditate. You shall meditate on this law. It shall not depart from your mouth day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you'll have good success. In verse 9 of Joshua 1, have I not commanded you? He says, he promises you'll have good success. Then he gives them the reason, the promise, why that he can believe this. Verse 9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened. Do not be dismayed. For Yahweh your God is with you wherever you go. That's the secret to success. The Yahweh is with you. The first habit of highly successful slaves is the living coram Deo. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be dismayed. Yahweh is ever present, omnipresent God of the universe. Of course, again, Joseph pointing to Jesus. Who was Jesus? He was Emmanuel, God with us. John 1, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness. The darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. There's a verse for you. Who were born, it's talking about not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. And then verse 14, and the Word that was God, the Word that is God, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, tabernacled among us. He was Emmanuel, God with us. And we have seen his glory. The glory is the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And then, so at the beginning, it's interesting, at the beginning of Matthew, we have the promise of Jesus. We have the birth of Jesus, and it says, and it quotes Isaiah saying, Emmanuel, call his name Emmanuel, God with us. So the beginning of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, begins with God with us, Emmanuel. And then at the end, we have the Great Commission, where Jesus gives the Great Commission at the end of his ministry, before his ascension to the right hand of the Father. And what does he say? It says in Matthew 28, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, here's the key, I am with you always to the end of the age. Go. All authority in heaven and on earth, Jesus said, has been given to me. Go baptize, go disciple nations, not just individuals, nations. Nations. How can you say that? How can we do that? Behold, I am with you. I am the God who's with you. I'm Emmanuel, God with us. I am with you always to the end of the age. Cormdale, living Cormdale. The first habit of highly successful slaves is living Cormdale in the presence of God before the face of God. Now to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, to God, who alone is wise, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Please stand. Let's pray together.